A-Level 2021, question number 3, MCQ paper. Please pause the video and study the question carefully before starting the discussion. Well, this question is about the memory in the computer. So I have written down the memories and the type of storage devices given in the question here on the board. So what is the importance of memory with regard to a computer? So as human beings, we also have the memory. We have a short-term memory and a long-term memory. The computer also has or must have a memory to store data and instructions. So if we just go a little bit back to the history of computing, there was a time that there was no mechanism in the computers to store something. In simple terms, there was no memory in the computers at the very beginning of this computing history. So when someone wanted to run a program in the computer, they had to input data, and at the same time, they had to input the instructions. So there was no memory to store data and the instructions, but the output was, or the process was done, and the output was given immediately, and it was stored in somewhere else, not inside the computer, not inside the computer. So there was one computer scientist known as John von Neumann. Once he proposed memory for the computer. His idea was that there should be the possibility of storing the data and instructions in the computer and using them again and again, rather than inputting these data and instructions at the time of processing. So this was really a revolutionary idea at that time, though it does not look much important today. It was a revolutionary idea at that time, because no one had thought at that time of storing the data and instructions inside the computer. So John von Neumann suggested memory, separate memory for the computer and a processing unit. So as a result, we had the computers on von Neumann architecture. Even today, we use the computers in that architecture. We call it the von Neumann architecture computers, or there is another term for that one, stored program architecture. Stored program architecture. Right? The architecture. So, or we call it the von Neumann architecture. Von Neumann architecture. So these are the type of computers we use even today. So what is special about it is there is a separate memory and a separate processing unit in the computer. So in a computer, there are different type of memories. Why do you need the memory? To store something. So something here is the data as well as the instructions. So some memories are short-term memories. Some memories are long-term memories, but we don't categorize it in that way, but we have some other categorizations. We call them volatile memories and non-volatile memories. So there we talk about the computer memory in relation to, or we can't forget about the CPU in the computer when you talk about the memory. So what is the CPU? CPU is the central processing unit. So it is something similar to the human brain, which is inside your head. So we have our body, and the processing unit of the human being is really the brain. So in the computer, the processing unit is the central processing unit in the modern computer. So central processing unit can access some kind of memories in the computer and fetch data and instructions to the CPU. So we talk about the memories in relation to this CPU. So if you take this storage medium, hard disk. This is the place where the users store their programs and instructions permanently. So we call it the non-volatile memory because even after a power cut, what is stored in this memory or in this storage will not be lost. So this is called a non-volatile memory. So your programs or the instructions and data are permanently stored here. But there is a problem. What is it? CPU cannot access the hard disk directly. Instead, the mechanism inside the computer is to copy the necessary data and instructions into another memory called the main memory. This is known as the main memory. So in practice, we call it the RAM, random access memory. So what you want to execute or the instructions should be loaded first to the RAM, and the data should be loaded to the RAM. So the data and instructions may be available here in the hard disk, or you may use the input devices to input the data and even the instructions. So they are stored here in the RAM or the main memory. CPU can access the main memory and fetch data. So fetch, FETCH, fetch data to itself and process. So at the beginning of this computing history, so this was a great improvement really. But computer scientists always try to increase the speed of the CPU. So there was a problem again. So you know that the CPU is on a circuit board, a special circuit board of the memory of the computer that is known as the motherboard. So CPU socket and especially the CPU itself is on the motherboard, and the memory is on the motherboard. So motherboard is the main circuit of board of the computer. So there are many other input and output devices connected to the motherboard through different ports. So then whatever available here in this memory should be fetched to the CPU. So the CPU uses a path. So this path is known as a bus. We usually call it the bus, right? So then, as we already know, the computer scientists tried to increase the speed of the CPU, but it was no use because the CPU took some time to reach here to the main memory and fetch the data and instructions here. There was a delay. There was a certain delay, but it was very small delay, very small fraction of a second. But comparing with the speed of the CPU, this was very huge delay, right? Very big delay. Even a fraction of a second would be a very big delay for the CPU because CPU was very fast. This condition is normally known as the von Neumann bottleneck. This condition is known as the von Neumann bottleneck. So there have had many different mechanisms to overcome this problem. What is it? The von Neumann bottleneck. One such mechanism is introducing a memory called the cache memory. Cache memory. What is the cache memory? So cache, new memory was introduced to the computer system known as the cache memory. So where is it available or where is it located? So there are some levels of the cache memory. What are they? L1 cache, L2 cache, L3 cache. So L1 cache is a small memory and it is usually located inside the CPU chip here, L1. L1 is located inside the CPU chip, right? So what was stored here? What was stored inside the L1 cache? So the computer scientists understood the computer always processes some special kind of instructions from the start of the computer to the very end of until you turn it off. So then there were some instructions that the CPU very often, regularly fetched from the memory and executed. Those instructions were taken and stored in the L1 cache. Now, what happened was the CPU could fetch the instructions or these special instructions stored in L1 cache quite rapidly. So it took a very little time for the CPU to reach here rather than coming all down this bus. Then there is L2 cache. L2 cache is also located either inside the CPU chip L2 or on the motherboard, very close to the CPU. On the motherboard, very close to the CPU, L2 cache. So L3 cache again located in between the CPU and the RAM. L3 cache is located inside the CPU, in between the CPU and the RAM. Right? So if you just think about this memory, registers. So register memory is a very small memory. So where is it located? It is known as the fastest memory available in the computer. It is also located in the CPU chip, registers. So what is the purpose of the registers? So there are different types of registers that should be discussed separately. But here I will just talk a little about the register memory. So registers, so there are different kind of registers. There are some registers that store memory addresses. So what is a memory address? So this is the main memory, or we usually call it the RAM, random access memory. In this random access memory, there are memory blocks. So random access memory is divided into memory blocks. Each of these blocks has an address. These memory blocks have addresses. So there is the need for the CPU to find out these addresses, and there are some registers that store the memory addresses. There are some special registers. And another example is if you take a mathematical expression like this, 3 into 2 plus 5. 3 into 2 plus 5. So in this operation, we know that this takes place. 3 into 2 takes place first. So there is an answer that is 6. This 6, before adding it to number 5, this 6 should be stored somewhere. So there is no way of this number 6 to float in the air. It must be stored in a particular location in the memory. But if the CPU decides to store this number 6 here in the RAM, but then immediately number 6 will be needed back to add with 5. Then again CPU has to come all the way back and take the same number 6 back to the CPU because it wants to add it with number 5. So to prevent this delay, it would be a very unnecessary delay. To prevent a delay, so there are some registers that store some intermediate steps of a mathematical operation like this. So intermediate steps will be stored in some special memories or registers. Yeah. So these are the kind of memories. So you can just draw this here on something like this. So these 5 type of memories can be divided like this. On the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's say CPU is here related to or that very close to the top part of this sketch. Then what is the closest memory to the CPU? That is the registers. Registers are known as the closest memory to the CPU. Then, as we explained earlier, cache memories are also very close to the CPU, but there are some levels of the cache memory. L1 cache is the closest memory to the CPU. Then L1 cache should come here. L1 cache. Then L2 cache, in the question they are given, L2 cache should come here. Then the next one is the main memory or the RAM. Main memory, we usually call it the RAM. Remember that in A-level ICT, sometimes this RAM is known as the primary memory. primary memory. But there is a problem when you call the primary memory to the main memory there. So there is another meaning of the primary memory. But sometimes in A-level syllabus they call it the what you call the primary memory, right? So then hard disk is at the very bottom here. It is the farthest from the CPU, hard disk. So when you approach these memories, or when you come from top to bottom, so this shape is very important because this indicates the capacity is increasing when you go down from bottom to say that top to bottom. The capacity of these memories are increasing. So capacity increases. So if you go from bottom up, right? So here capacity decreases. Capacity here increases. Capacity increases, and here capacity decreases. Capacity decreases. And if you think about the speed, where do you think is the fastest memory is located here? So here on the top, fast, because these are the memories which are very close to the CPU. Then when you go up in this arrow or in this sketch, the speed increases. The speed increases. Right? When you go down or top to bottom, so that is the speed decreases. The speed decreases. Right? This is what you should have in your mind before you answer this question. So we'll go to the question. So here is the question. There are different type of storage components. What are they? They are given as storage component L1 cache, L2 cache, main memory, registers, and hard disk. So here capacity increases and the access speed decreases from top to bottom. So when you go from top to bottom here, what happens is the capacity increases and the access speed really decreases. So if you just arrange these memories in this chart, so let's say on the top of this sketch, there should be the register memory among the memories and storage devices given in the question. So the registers, A equals registers, they are in two answers, answer number 4 and 5. So you can just forget about the first, second, and third answers there. So out of these two, let's see, number 5, registers, then main memory, L2 cache. So you can understand cache memories are very close to the CPU, but just below the registers. So main memory should go back here. Then it is not the correct answer. Let's see the answer number 4. Registers, that is on the top. Then L1 cache, L2 cache, yes. Then main memory or the random access memory and the hard disk. So the correct answer is answer number 4.